When you can tag yourself when you get in, so I know who is here. I realized I didn't have to type that. You can hear me when I talk. Sorry. But that'll be for the other people coming in. Still 3-4 minutes before we should get started. An extra benefit, you guys get to see my home office. This is where I do most of my work from. Hi there, Jacob. Oh, it's Brianna. Okay, you guys have these weird usernames. I don't know who you are. I mean, can't tell just from your username who you are. Can you hear me okay? Is this volume right? Should I turn it up a little bit? Thank you. This is a little bit like how I see myself on camera. I hate seeing myself on camera, and now I'm just staring at it. And that is, I know you're used to looking at me. I hate looking at myself, so I'll do my best not to look at it. I don't know how that'll help. Maybe I wonder if I can switch over to a different window so I'm not looking at this the whole time. Oh well. Give it a couple minutes, and then we'll get started. And there's no excuse for being late to this. I mean, come on, guys. You don't have to get out of bed for this today. All right, this is going to take about 1 more minute, and then we'll get started. And if people come in late, well, first off, we don't like those people, so forget them. And second off, this is my understanding. This stream gets preserved for hours, maybe days, maybe forever. Who the hell knows? And so you'll be able to go back and watch it later, which could be useful when you're studying for your test, which will be coming up. I think I want to say December 14th is our final exam. Sound about right? It is on the syllabus, hasn't changed, so back there. All right, so first let's do a little bit of groundskeeping. So we did have those makeup assignments for the past week of class. I appreciate all of your patience in going through those and doing this. I know it's not as much fun as regular class, but I appreciate your understanding. I've got a lot of very positive, happy messages from you guys, and I really do appreciate it. This has been real rough for me, but as you can see, I'm feeling a lot better. I'm looking better. I'm not quite 100% yet. The reason we're doing this online rather than in class, honestly, is mostly because of driving to work is a real problem for me right now. It's just I can probably sit and teach, but getting to class in the first place is kind of hard. So do this today, and Friday we should be able to get back to regular class, but we'll see. Worst case scenario, we'll do this again. So everything else, we are back on regular schedule. We are supposed to be talking about political parties today, so we'll do that. Everything else is going to be right back to where it is supposed to be. We'll move on to our next topic for Friday. Reading assignments, everything is exactly as it's supposed to be, and we'll be going forward with the rest of the semester as if nothing had happened. And so let's just all live in a make-believe world and pretend nothing happened. During these sessions, if you've got questions, the best way to do it is just to put it in that little chat box over there. It pops up on my screen, and then I can see you, and I can see whatever questions you have. It'll also give me, if you want to talk about a subject more or you miss something, just like in regular class, typing in the chat box is just like asking a question, except you don't have to raise your hand first because I don't have to address it immediately. You don't have to worry about interrupting me. All right, so let's get started. Today we're talking about political parties. And we're going to divide this up into two segments. First, we are going to talk about what political parties do in American government, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the development of political parties. We've already talked about this a little bit. You might remember we talked about how the Democratic Party of today is not really the same in any way except name with the Democratic Party that existed before 1968. And the same is true of the Republican Party. And that's due to something called realignments. And we'll get to those in the second half of this class. First, though, I want to talk about what political parties are actually for. And this is actually a weird question for American government because political parties in America are very different than political parties in other parts of the world. So if we were in Italy, for instance, and we were talking about political parties, a political party would be something that you would be a formal member of. That is, you would apply to become a member of that political party. You'd probably pay dues to be a member of that political party. And you would have a little card, and you, of course, would always vote for that political party. In most of the world, the idea that you could be a member of a political party but vote for a different party is just nonsense. It doesn't make any sense to say, oh, I'm a social democrat, but I'm going to vote for the Christian Democrats. Because if you're going to vote for the Christian Democrats, you would just be a Christian Democrat. Where in America, there's nothing wrong with someone saying, oh, I'm a Republican, but I'm going to vote for the Democrats. Or I'm a Democrat and vote for the Republican. Or I'm an independent, I'm going to vote for one party or the other. And that's what makes American political parties unique. So let's talk a little about what these political parties actually do. So we kind of talked about political parties and their functions on a couple of different levels. So let's start off by thinking about political parties on the level of the individual. That is, me as an individual, as a voter, as a citizen. What does a political party do for me? So a political party for me as a citizen is primarily what we call a heuristic. That's Heuristic. A heuristic. Heuristic is also a mental shortcut. It's a way to simplify things, to make life a little bit easier for you. Now, American government and politics in general is really, really complicated. There's a lot of issues. People don't know where they stand on all of these issues. It's hard to tell what you should think about a given issue. So, for instance, should we build a bigger wall on the border? Well, there's a lot of considerations that go into that. I mean, yeah, maybe it would dissuade some undocumented immigrants coming in. But on the other hand, if you build a big wall, maybe let's go around the place where you don't have a wall. On the other hand, maybe you don't think undocumented immigration is that big a problem because we need agricultural workers. There's a lot of considerations that go into that. And so if you're trying to make up your mind about a hot political topic like adding barbed wire to our southern border, you'd have to take into account all of these different issues. And it'd be really hard for you or me or anyone else to really think deeply about all of these things, especially if you don't care very much about politics. Remember, most Americans don't care a whole lot about these things. So how do you decide what you're going to think about an issue, what you're going to do? Well, you can rely on a heuristic. That is, you can say, well, I'm a Democrat, and therefore I'm against it, or I'm a Republican, therefore I'm in favor of it. So the idea is that party works as a heuristic because it tells me who I'm supposed to pay attention to, what my issue is supposed to be. So I know if I'm a Democrat, I can listen to Democrats in the media, Democratic leadership in Congress, and say, oh, this is how they think about it, and therefore this is how I should think about it. And so I don't have to go through that very deep process of trying to figure out how I feel about an issue on my own. I can just pay attention to what my party thinks. And if I know what my party thinks, I know probably what I should think. Now, it's not going to be 100% effective. There's certainly issues where I might disagree with my party. But if all I'm doing is paying attention to the party, I'm going to get it right most of the time. And as long as we fall back on our belief that most Americans don't actually care that much about politics, well, then we're fine with the idea that they are okay with being right about an issue 80, 90% of the time, as long as they just go along with what the party thinks. So party works as a heuristic in telling us what we should be thinking about complex or difficult issues. For those just coming in, just a reminder, if you've got questions, just put it over in the chat window. Any questions, clarifications, anything you want me to mention, and I will deal with it when I get a chance. All right. So parties also work as a heuristic when it comes to voting. Now, a lot of you just voted for the first time, perhaps, in the most recent midterm election. And voting is made a heck of a lot easier by the fact that we have political parties. So in most elections for federal and state office for the most part, you're going to have every candidate attached to a political party that is next to their names, because say if they're Republican or Democrat or Libertarian or what. Now, the reason that's there is to make it easier for you to vote. That is, if I know if I'm a strong Republican, I can go in the voting booth and just vote for everyone with an R next to their name, and I'm going to be voting for the right people, again, almost all the time. Now, it's not always going to be right. Even if I'm a strong Republican, there might be some Republican candidates I disagree with, I don't like. But if I just vote for the Republican candidate, I'm going to vote for the candidate I probably would have picked had I done all the research most of the time. And for most Americans, that's good enough. This is what we call satisficing. So it's not that we're getting to the optimal outcome. The best possible outcome for voting is to look at every single candidate, think about every issue, really go in depth, do your homework, figure out where you stand on the issue, where all the candidates stand on the issue, and use that to determine exactly how you're supposed to vote. The problem is that takes a lot of work, and most Americans don't care enough to do it. So if I can satisfice, I can get 80 or 90% correct just by looking at a little letter next to their name, I'm going to do that instead. It just makes a lot of sense for me to get it almost entirely right just by voting for the Republican or voting for the Democrat. Now, you'll notice that there are also third parties, the Libertarian Party, the Green Party, like that. And we'll get to those a little bit later when we talk about the development of American political parties. So, for the most part, Americans can use parties to vote, to tell them how they're supposed to vote in a given election. And again, it's going to be right most of the time. States try and make this pretty easy. That is, most states are going to allow what we call straight ticket voting. And straight ticket voting simply means that they put all the candidates for a given party on the same line going across in the row. Now, you might have seen this if you voted in the most recent election. The reason they do this is so that I can just say, oh, I'm Republican, I'm going to vote for all the Republicans, and just click one button to go all the way across. So it's useful and it makes life a lot easier. Now, does it actually make it easier? Does it make it more likely for people to vote? The answer seems to be yes. We know it makes it easier for people to vote, mostly because when we don't give these sort of party cues, voters don't cast ballots on those issues. So there are plenty of mostly local offices where there are no party cues attached. So if you're voting for your local school board, for instance, they're generally not going to tell you whether people are running for school board or for city council perhaps, or Republicans or Democrats. So how are you supposed to know who to vote for? Well, if you don't have that heuristic of party to work so you can satisfy, what you have to do instead is actually go back and do the research and try and figure out which candidate you actually agree with, and that's a lot of work. So what we expect happens when people have this sort of, they don't have the partisan cues that make it easy for them to vote. Well, if they actually have to do the research, they just don't cast a vote in those races. And we see in those races, we have lots and lots of what we call drop-off. That is, people get to those races, generally at the bottom of the ballot, and they go, you know what, never mind. I don't know who to vote for here. I don't know what these guys are. I don't care. And they just don't vote in those races at all. So this sort of drop-off happens a lot whenever there isn't a partisan cue attached to the voter, to the candidate. We also see this whenever there's issues. So in a lot of elections, you're not going to have just candidates, but also ballot initiatives, state constitutional amendments, things like that, where voters are asked to vote yes or no on an issue rather than for or against a candidate. Now, the yes or no issue, again, is not going to have a Republican or Democrat attached to it because issues are not Republican issues or Democratic issues. They're just issues. And so a lot of voters are going to drop off and just not cast ballots and cast the ballot for those issues. So the partisan cue function, the heuristic function in voting is very important because it makes it much, much easier for people to vote. In the absence of those partisan cues, people just don't vote very much because it's so much harder to vote when you actually have to go back and do all the homework. Remember, in American politics, a lot of the struggle campaigns have is to get people to the ballot box. And actually is physically going to the ballot box and voting. This is a process that takes 10, 15 minutes in most municipalities. It's not a big deal. The process of actually studying the elections, studying all the candidates and figuring out exactly where they want to stand, well, that's something that can take hours. So if we can't get people to spend 10, 15 minutes to vote, how are we going to convince people to spend hours to figure out who all the candidates are and how they're supposed to vote on all these issues? The answer is we know we're not going to be able to. So the partisan cues help make sure voters actually are going to cast the ballots. Now let's move on. So we've got individual voters. So for individual voters, parties work as a heuristic. They're also going to work as a portion of their identity. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about the way people construct their identity. That'd be more for a social psychology or even a political psychology class. But the important thing to understand here is that all of us have a lot of identities that we might assign ourselves at one point in time. So you might be a member of your racial group, African American or white or Hispanic or whatever. You might be having a separate identity as your gender, as a man or a woman, or as sexuality, as someone who's straight or as homosexual or heterosexual or asexual or whatever. So you're going to have a lot of different potential identities. You can have identity as a member of religion. So I might have an identity as a Catholic, as well as have an identity as a man and as a married person, as a father. So I have all these different identities. These identities can conflict with each other. So it could be that my identity as a Catholic conflicts with my political identity as a Republican or whatever my political views are. So party provides a separate identity. That is, I can see myself not just as a Catholic or as a man or as being white or as being heterosexual, but I can also see myself as being a Republican or being a Democrat or being a libertarian. And that gives me a sense of identity and a sense of belonging and causes me to associate with other people who have a similar identity. So I'm going to feel myself, if I'm a Republican, I'm going to feel myself being close to other Republicans in the same way that I might feel close to other Catholics or other men. Now, why is that important? It's important because identity is very important in the way we shape our political views and our social views. We see ourselves through the lens of of our various identities. And so politics becomes an identity as well. We're going to see ourselves as being a member of that party. It's going to shape the way we view other people. So it means when I process information, if I'm a Republican, I'm going to be more sympathetic to other Republicans. I'm going to be less sympathetic to Democrats. because they're not part of my group. It's almost like having a tribe, having this group that you're a part of. And that's going to be very influential in the way people view politics. Now, the reason identity is such a fraught issue is that your different identities might have cross-cutting effects on the way you view certain issues. So again, I might have one view as a Republican and a different view as a Catholic. And those two identities come into conflict. It can be psychologically distressing for people. In addition, it means that just knowing what my identity isn't always going to tell me how I should feel about an issue or a candidate. And that means that I'm going to have to choose which identity is applicable in any given circumstance. So if sometimes I might be thinking of this as an issue where my Catholicism is most important. So if I'm thinking about capital punishment and thinking about as a Catholic, well, then I'm going to come to a very different conclusion. I might be anti-capital punishment, as the Catholic Church says you're supposed to be. Where if I'm Republican, I might be pro-capital punishment because the Republican Party says that. So how to resolve this sort of difference, this sort of cross-cutting, Well, what I'm generally going to do is choose one identity. That is, for some one reason or another, a single particular identity is going to be more relevant at that time. So if I'm in church, my identity as a Catholic might be more important. Whereas if I'm at a political rally, my identity as a Republican might be more important. So when we've got multiple identities, people are going to be primed to think about one particular identity at a time, and that's going to really shape what their views are. Now, if they have cross-cutting identities that lead in different conclusions about different candidates or different issues, well, in that case, they're going to have to pick an identity, and it's going to depend on circumstances, and it's going to depend on the way an issue is framed. So we haven't talked a lot about issue framing, but the idea is this presented as a political issue or a religious issue or a gender issue? And the way an issue is presented can change the way I feel about the issue because it leads me to worry about, bring up different identities in response to that issue. All right, so individual voters. We use parties as a heuristic. We use parties as an identity. Let's move on to the level of candidates. So if I'm a candidate or an office holder, what does a party do for me there? So as a candidate, what a party generally does is provide resources. So in the old days, the days of machine politics, so we're really talking, remember we talked quite a bit about the end of machine politics. Remember James Garfield gets shot, Chester Arthur comes in and passes civil service reform in the 1880s. And so prior to that, between the golden age of parties, starting with Andrew Jackson in the 1830s and going up until Chester A. Arthur in the 1880s, this is really the golden era of machine politics. And during that period, the job of political parties was to pick candidates and run them for office. And they would provide all the resources those candidates needed. And those parties, really, it didn't matter who the candidate themselves were. The party would dictate everything they did. In those days, there's no such thing as a primary election. Party bosses would pick who the candidates were for any individual office. Now, why does that matter? Well, it means that loyalty to the political bosses was the most important thing a candidate could have. If a candidate was loyal to the political bosses, and did what the political bosses want, they could keep on getting elected, keep on getting the nomination of the party imprimatur. If they did something the party bosses didn't want, they'd be out. Remember, before you have senators being directly elected by the people, well, that's not until the early part of the 20th century. In the 19th century, senators are elected by the state legislatures and essentially by the political bosses. So if an individual senator voted away the political bosses didn't like, they could be removed in the middle of their term. This happened quite a bit in the United States Senate, where the Senate would just be kicked out of office because people didn't like, the political bosses didn't like what they were doing. And at the very least, even if they didn't kick you out of the Senate, if you were in the House or you're a governor, if you didn't do what they wanted, you would not get the nomination of the party next time. You would have no chance of winning re-election. If you remember, this is actually what happened to Chester Arthur. Even though he was a very productive, very relatively popular president at the time, he pissed off his party, by pursuing civil service reform, and therefore just didn't get reelected. Couldn't get reelected, didn't get the party nomination, and he was gone. So parties had an enormous amount of power to pick who their candidates were and to keep their elected officials in line. However, once we got rid of that system and the machine system starts to collapse in the 1880s, and surely by the 1940s it's totally gone. The big thing that leads to that collapse is what we call the rise of primary elections. Now, primary elections are part of the progressive reforms that take place between about 1890 and 1920. We talked about the progressive era before. The idea of the progressive era is that humanity is perfectible, that you can pass laws and regulations that will make society better, will make society perfect in some way. Now, as we talked about, this led to a lot of very weird outcomes, where you have the progressives doing things like banning alcohol, because they thought alcohol, they're not wrong about this, leads to gambling and leads to men cheating on their wives and men beating their wives. So you should ban alcohol. But they also want to do things like eugenics, where they wanted to separate out African Americans and whites, and they wanted to sterilize criminals to make sure they wouldn't reproduce. So a lot of problematic stuff with the progressive era. But the best part of the progressive era is really their work on political reforms. So the progressives were trying to fix the political system, mostly by getting rid of the political machines. And the biggest way they did that was by getting rid of the sort of party boss system of picking candidates. Now, again, in New Jersey, this is a weird thing to talk about because most of the country got rid of the political boss system a long time ago, but New Jersey, we pretty much still have political bosses picking who our candidates are going to be. So let's pretend we're not in New Jersey for a little bit and the political boss system actually did go away. Well, what killed it was primary elections. So primary elections are, we've talked about these before as well, primary elections are elections in which members of a party get together to choose who their candidate is going to be. So in New Jersey, we have what's called a semi-closed primary system, meaning that if I'm a Democrat, I'm going to get to vote for who the Democratic candidate for office is going to be. So there's going to be, when I go to the voting booth on primary election day, there's going to be a list of Democrats, and I can pick one of those Democrats to be the nominee for whatever office I'm voting for. So most recently in my district, New Jersey's 11th district, in the House of Representatives, there were 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats running for that House seat in the primary. So voters got to pick one of those 5. One Democrats got to vote for a Democrat, Republicans got to pick for a Republican. Now, primary elections in general aren't just to be that successful, mostly because voter turnout in primary elections is incredibly low. Remember, we have trouble getting people to come out and vote for a general election. So in a primary election, it's really hard. Now, we already talked about one reason why turnout in primary elections might be so low, and that is the lack of party cues. That is, normally in an election, I know who I'm supposed to vote for. I'm supposed to vote for the Republican or vote for the Democrat, depending on what my party is. But in a primary election, they're all Republicans or they're all Democrats. So I can't use my party cue to tell me who I'm supposed to vote for. So how do I choose? Well, it gets harder. I'm actually going to have to do my homework. And as we know, when you ask voters to do their homework, the dominant thing they do is not show up at the polls and vote. So turnout in primary elections is going to be pretty low. And most candidates, or at least incumbents, are just going to win their primary elections without too much of a problem. But primary elections are important, even though turnout in those primary elections is so low. Primary elections are important because they take that out of the hands of the party bosses. Without primary elections, the party themselves picks who the nominees are going to be. Now, that can be a good thing that encourages party responsibility. That is, somebody is trying to look out for what the best interests of the party are, rather than what the best interests of that individual candidate are. But it's bad in that it can lead to corruption, that those party bosses can demand things from the candidates that they choose. And if you don't do what the party bosses want, they're going to make sure you don't get the nomination again. So it can cause corruption. It increases accountability because somebody's looking out for the best interest of the party, but it has the opportunity to lead to corruption. So primary elections are a way to get around that. We reduce the corruption by making sure that party bosses themselves can't pick who the nominees are going to be. Now, this isn't 100% effective. Again, in New Jersey, we have primary elections, but we still do have a primary boss selection system, where essentially the party bosses figure out who they want to win the primary, and they put their resources behind that individual. As a result, we have a primary, but we kind of know who's going to win that primary from the start. So primary elections are useful, and they take power out of the hands of the bosses and put that in the hands of the people. Now, again, that's not an unalloyed good, simply because the people don't necessarily know what they want, and the people don't turn out and vote a lot. But at least in theory, it's going to work. Now, we'll talk later about why this actually becomes problematic because of the reduction in accountability. That is, there's no one who's actually responsible for the party. I mean, imagine how different the system would be in 2016, for instance, if we had a party boss system, if we had the party choosing the candidates rather than the people in primary elections doing it. The Republican Party never would have chosen Donald Trump. The Republican voters chose Donald Trump, But Republican leadership didn't like him at all. They would have chosen Jeb Bush or Ted Cruz or someone else that they would have found more palatable and thought had a better chance of winning. So the party bosses might have a better idea of what's good for the party, but the progressive reform, especially the primary elections, took that power away from the party. So what does the party do now, since they're not actually picking the candidates? And in essence, parties can't even prevent themselves from being taken over by candidates they don't like. So the Republican Party, again, the Republican Party leadership didn't want Donald Trump, but the voters liked him. So they wind up with Donald Trump and having to support Donald Trump whether they like him or not. Victims almost of a hostile takeover of the Republican Party. So what do the parties do for candidates now? Well, the big thing they do is provide organization and expertise. That is, if I'm Republican and running for office, I have access to resources put together by the Republican Party. And the Republican Party is going to help me win election. Now, most times it's going to take money, but it can also just be things like voter guides, lists of voters, canvassing lists, access to volunteers, access to experts who can help me win re-election. It also is important that it provides me with the imprimatur of the party. That is, once I win that primary election, I am now the official Republican or the official Democrat running in that race. And as a result, well, the voters are going to know what I stand for, and I don't have to necessarily articulate it as well as they would otherwise. I don't have to tell voters what I stand for. They know I'm the Republican or I'm the Democrat, and so they're going to vote for me, but using that heuristic function we talked about before. Parties are also going to spend a lot of time recruiting candidates. One of the main functions, especially of local political parties, is to recruit individual candidates. That is, the first thing a party has to do if they want to have any chance of winning is to actually go ahead and get someone to run for office. How do you do that? You have to find people in the community who'd be willing to run. Now, oftentimes it's going to be someone who's already in office. So I'm looking for a House seat. I'm going to when we look for people who are already running mayors or members of city council or state legislators, and I'm going to recruit from them. But if I'm recruiting for lower levels, I might be recruiting individual citizens, people who seem interested in politics, people who've been giving money, people giving speeches in local areas. And I'm going to try and recruit them to run for office and eventually recruit them to run for higher office. So what the party's going to do for individual candidates is going to recruit them, going to give them expertise, give them money, it's going to give them the imprimatur, and it's going to try and help them win, because of course no party can survive very long if they're not actually having people win. Now, once someone gets elected and they're actually in government, the party is going to have a different function as well. That is, the party in government is going to function mostly as an organizational body. That is, going to organize people, tell them how to vote and who to vote for. And this means that the members of Congress and people in government are going to be treating parties much the same way that individual voters are. Remember, individual voters use parties as a way to simplify their decisions, to use as a heuristic to say, okay, I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat, so this is how I'm supposed to vote. Well, the same holds true when we're looking at members of Congress. They simply don't have the time or energy to become experts in all the areas they have to vote on. So how do they decide how they're going to vote? Well, they ask their party. They go to party leadership, and the party leadership will tell them, okay, we're voting this way on this and this way on this. That's not to say they always have to vote that way. They can do whatever they like, though there might be consequence down the line. But it gives them a baseline of what they should be doing. And that's important for them. It's also going to help them organize government by the election of officials. So the Speaker of the House is elected by the majority party in the House of Representatives. And a similar process is going to be taking place in every state legislature. In fact, in most towns even, you're going to have members of the same party caucusing together. And a caucus is just an informal or formal group of elected officials. And that group is going to get there and decide, okay, this is how we're going to vote on these issues. So it makes life a lot easier for them. It's also going to work for fundraising. Now, we've mentioned this before, but most members of Congress, for most members of Congress, the number one job is raising money. They have to raise enormous amounts of money in order to win re-election and run for office. Well, where do you get that money from? Well, they get it from donors, of course. They have to call individual people on the phone and ask them for money. But they're also going to be getting money for the party and raising funds for the party. That is, if I'm a member of Congress, some portion of the money that I raise doesn't go to me, but rather goes to help my political party, goes to the party coffers, goes to the Republican or the Democratic Party. And this system is actually fairly formalized, depending which committee I'm appointed to in Congress. So I get appointed from the House of Representatives, the Speaker of the House is going to appoint me to various committees. When they appoint me to those committees, they're going to tell me how much money I'm expected to raise in order to maintain my seat on that committee. So if I'm on a committee like the Defense Committee or Armed Services Committee that controls a lot of money because of military contracts, I'm expected to raise a lot of money for the party. Because I have to deal with all that money in military contracts, it's expected I'll be able to raise a lot of money, so I have to kick some of that money back to the political party. And this system isn't really that different than the sort of system we had in the 19th century with the kickbacks instituted under the patronage system of Andrew Jackson. It's pretty similar, and the amount of money can be staggering. So if I'm on the committee that writes tax reform, that write tax bills, well, in the House of Representatives, I might be expected to pay up to $500,000 every year back to the party in order to maintain that seat. Because the party needs someone in there who is loyal, and how do you show you're loyal? Well, you give a lot of money. And if you're not willing to raise that money from the party, somebody else is going to want that seat on that powerful committee enough that they'll be willing to give that amount of money back. Now, what does that money do? Well, it helps the party get more people elected. Sorry. And because it helps them get more people elected, it's going to help with all those resources, the experts, the money we talked about before, and help people get elected and therefore increase the power of the party going forward. So in government, and for elected officials, parties are going to serve as an organizational principle. It's also going to help people get organized. Essentially, Congress is a very complicated place, and the issues they're asked to deal with are themselves incredibly complicated. So how is it that we can figure out how we're supposed to vote on these things and reduce the dimensionality of the issues? Well, parties was going to do it. This is a little bit of a complicated idea, but let's try and dig into this idea of dimensionality. So a lot of issues that Congress deals with have different facets to them. That is, it might be an issue that's about taxes, but it also might be about property. It also might be about healthcare. So you have all these different issues going on at once, oftentimes in the same bill. How are you supposed to decide how to vote on this? Now, this is actually a lot like we just talked about with identity. That is, I know I feel this way about this issue and this way about this issue. But if these two come into conflict, how am I supposed to vote on these things? For members of Congress, these conflicts can be resolved by party. That is, I can say, okay, I'm Republican. This is how I'm supposed to vote, so this is what I'm going to do. And I don't have to think about beyond that. It reduces these very complex issues down to just a single dimension. Is this a Republican issue or a Democratic issue? And I know if I'm Republican or Democrat, therefore, I know how I'm supposed to vote. And so in most cases, members of Congress are going to vote with their party. This way I might often hear during an election campaign, this candidate, the Republicans, they voted with Donald Trump 89% of the time. Well, it doesn't mean that they're a big fan of Donald Trump. It means that they're a Republican. And so Republicans tend to vote together almost all the time. 89% would actually be considered to be pretty low. Similarly, we're going to find that Democrats are going to vote with Donald Trump 10% of the time at best. Simply because Democrats all tend to vote together because they're using party as their organizational structure and telling them how to vote. This is actually formalized in Congress and in most state legislatures with the role of what's called a whip. It's WHIP. And the idea of a whip is to actually get members to vote the way the party wants them to vote on a given bill. So the whips are going to be members of Congress in leadership whose job it is to make sure that everyone votes the way they're supposed to vote on a particular issue. And we can actually also use this as a verb. The idea is that someone is getting whipped. It doesn't mean they're literally getting whipped, although whatever they're into, cool with me. But it doesn't mean literally getting whipped, but it means they're getting a lot of pressure from their party, telling them how they're supposed to vote on that given issue. And the whips are also going to be responsible for what's called the whip count. That is telling leadership how many people are voting for this bill or against this bill, so they know if the bill is going to pass or not. So that's what parties do. And again, it's very different than we're going to have in other countries. Most other democracies in the world have what we call a parliamentary system. In a parliamentary system, you basically aren't even voting for an individual member or individual legislator. In most countries, the parliamentary systems, you're voting for your party. So instead of voting for, in this district, Mikey Sherrill, your newly elected member of Congress, you'd be voting for the Democrats or voting for the Republicans. Now, what that means is that you vote, and the party is going to pick who the candidates are that are going to represent them. Then when that party gets a majority, so Democrats got the majority in the most recent election in the U.S. House of Representatives, then that party would pick whose good members were going to be, and then they would do whatever they said they were going to do. They would make a commitment. The party would have a platform, and would make a commitment to do certain things if they were elected. And if they got elected, they would simply do those things. Now, in American politics, it's quite a bit more complicated than that. It doesn't work that way. I'm not going to vote. I don't vote for just a party. I vote for individuals. And those individuals might or may not agree with what the party wants to do. So the parties don't have the sort of responsibility we see in other countries. And also individual voters are able to split their ticket in a way that's not possible in other countries. So for instance, there's plenty of Republicans who vote for Democrats and plenty of Democrats who vote for Republicans. And in America, that makes perfect sense, and that's fine. This happens a lot. In other countries, that is, of course, impossible. It's impossible because they don't necessarily have the sort of federal system that we have here. Where in America, the reason it might make sense to split your ticket between Republicans and Democrats would be that maybe you don't like a particular Republican or particular Democrat who's representing your party. Well, in other countries, if you're voting for just the party, that's question's irrelevant. You might also do it because you want to vote for one set of officials on the state level and one set of officials on the federal level. Again, in other countries where you don't necessarily have a distinction between state and federal government, that distinction is just meaningless. That doesn't make sense. So as a result, parties in America wind up being quite a bit weaker than parties in other parts of the world, and other democracies. They just can't deliver in the way that other parties can. In Italy, if I vote for the Socialist Party wins. I know exactly what they're going to do. And there's no question about whether or not they're going to do that. They have to do it. They get elected on that. And if they don't do it, well, they're going to lose re-election, or they're going to face a revolt from their own members. In America, parties basically never do what they say they're going to do, simply because they can't. The Democratic Party that just won in the House of Representatives by a pretty large margin. We're seeing right now they won 40 seats, which is a lot better than election day, and won by about 9% of the vote. So they did really well, and they can talk all they want about passing a Green New Deal where they're going to go back and do all this great environmental legislation and help the left behind parts of America by putting in solar panels, wind farms, and all that. And they can talk about all they want, but it doesn't freaking matter because they can't actually do anything because Donald Trump's the president, the Senate's still controlled by Republicans. So whatever the Democratic Party says they're going to do really just doesn't matter because they're not going to be able to do any of it anyway. So our parties are quite a bit weaker. Let's go back now and talk a little about the development of American political parties, where these political parties actually come from. And again, I'll remind you, if you have any questions or you need any clarification or anything while I'm talking, go ahead and just put it in the comments over on the side, and I'll address those questions as I come to them. Because otherwise I'm just talking to myself. This is really weird, guys. All right. So let's talk about the developed American political parties. We've already talked quite a bit about where American political parties come from. If you remember, American political parties have their genesis basically in George Washington's cabinet, with the Democratic Republicans, that comes out of Thomas Jefferson's party, versus the Federalists, that would be Alexander Hamilton's party. And you had all these disagreements in Washington's cabinet about the direction the country should be taking. Now, in order to bolster public support for their views, Jefferson and Hamilton went back and subscribed to newspapers. That is, they started newspapers. Subscribe meaning they paid in advance for them. In a sense, they were paying for the production of the newspaper. And they would go back and pay for newspapers to be created that would reflect their views. So Jefferson wanted certain policy put in place, mostly policies that were favorable to the South and to farmers and agrarians. And so he would go back and pay for newspapers to try and convince the public to be on his side on those issues. And Hamilton would do the same thing, pushing issues that were of benefit to bankers and urbanites. Now, they would go back and they create these newspapers in order to influence the public. And these newspapers and pamphlets they put out wound up actually structuring the political views of the public, because people get one set of newspapers or another set of newspapers, and that would shape all of their political views. And this really leads to the start of our first American political parties, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republicans. It doesn't say that all the early newspapers were very much Democratic, Republican, or Federalist. They weren't. But the ones that weren't actually fell into line pretty quickly. Because after all, nobody likes to be told they're an idiot. No one likes to be told that they're wrong about something. So if I'm a diehard Federalist and I'm reading a newspaper that has some things I like and some things I don't like, well, I'd rather read the newspaper that's all pro-Federalist, because it's going to make me feel better about myself, because it's going to tell me that I'm doing a good job, that I'm smart, that my leaders are doing the right thing. And so the papers that weren't entirely Federalist or Democratic Republican fell out of favor pretty quickly. So the political leaders, the early political parties come from the top down. Political leaders put together their views and create newspapers and try to influence the public to support what they already think. So where does it go from there? Well, political parties kind of start to take on a life of their own. So once you get to Andrew Jackson, remember Andrew Jackson had what we call the patronage system. That is, when Andrew Jackson came into Washington, Washington was still being run. The bureaucrats in Washington were dominantly the second son of Virginia planters. People who were from wealthy families that weren't, in the family business, and so they worked in Washington. Remember, all your presidents, with the exception of Adams and John Quincy Adams, up until Jackson, were basically Virginia planters, or rich white guys from Virginia. And so it was more rich white guys from Virginia that were running the government. And Jackson got in, and he didn't like the rich white guys from Virginia. He thought they were against him, and he wasn't wrong. They didn't like him. They thought he was terrible. Again, that's partially because he was terrible. But he thought they looked down on him, and they did look down on him, because they looked down on people from rural areas, as Tennessee, and border areas, as Tennessee was, and looked down on Jackson personally because he thought he was uncouth. Also, his wife was a bigamist, and he murdered a bunch of people. Potato. Anyway, Jackson wanted to get rid of all these guys. And while in theory, up to that point, you could have gotten rid of people who were in government, in practice, no one did. They just kept their jobs. But that's also because the people who came to office were kind of like the people who came to office for them. It's not like there's only people that Monroe likes, that Madison hates. They're all pretty similar. Anyway, when Jackson gets to office, he kicks them all out. This was called the patronage system, or the spoil system. That is, to the victor go the spoils. Jackson won the election, so therefore Jackson, get to pick who's going to be in office. And he wants to pick people who are loyal to him and his Democratic Party. And so he puts a bunch of loyal Democrats in office. Now, this evolves pretty quickly to being a kickback system and a corruption machine. Because, of course, how do you prove you're loyal? Well, I give you a job, so I expect a certain amount of your money to come back to me as a result. And this culminates, as we've already talked about, with the assassination of James Garfield and the election and his replacement with Chester Arthur and the passage of civil service reform laws. So we have this sort of patronage system in place. But what's also important about Andrew Jackson is that Andrew Jackson leads to the birth of the second American party system. So your first American party system is the Federalists versus the Democratic Republicans. But the Democratic Republicans become dominant. The Federalist Party really starts to die off after the election of 1800. Remember election of 1800, that's that crazy election with Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams. It's a whole mess. But the Federalist Party gets kicked out of office. This is also why we got Marbury Madison, if you remember, where the new Secretary of State didn't want to deliver a bunch of letters because the midnight appointments the Federalists were making. Regardless, the Federalist Party dies. And by about 1812, the Federalist Party doesn't exist anymore. And we're left with just one party, the Democratic Republican Party. And this is what we call the era of good feeling, and it ends with the election of Andrew Jackson. So with Andrew Jackson is such a polarizing figure, even though he's popular, relatively popular in the public. We don't have public opinion data, but by all accounts, he seems to be relatively popular. Despite that, there's enough resistance to him because he's such a polarizing figure that the people that don't like him, Democrats don't like him, actually start their own party. Jackson successfully takes over the Democratic Party, but we get an offshoot of the Democratic Party that's opposed to Andrew Jackson, we call the Whig Party. And this becomes our second system of American parties, which is the Whigs versus the Democratic Republicans. Eventually just be called the Democrats, and today we probably call them the Jacksonian Democrats, to distinguish them from the Jeffersonian Democrats that came before. So the second party system starts in the 1830s and is the Jacksonian Democrats versus the Whig Party. Now, the Whig Party doesn't do very well, all told. Now, it's not to say they don't win a lot of offices, they don't win an election. They do, but they're weak. They're much weaker than the Jacksonian Democrats, but because of their views. The Whig Party believes that the president shouldn't do anything. So when Whig presidents get elected, they don't do anything. And they do it very successfully, so successfully that you can't name any Whig presidents because you don't care about the Whig presidents because no one cares about them because they didn't do anything. Whereas the Jacksonian Democrats believe in a very strong, very forceful presidency, the way Andrew Jackson did. And as a result, they have presidents who do a lot more stuff and are very much more vital and get a lot more stuff done. And so they wind up being more powerful. The other problem the Whig Party has is that it's not clear where they stand on the major issue of the day. The big issue, by the time we get to the 1850s especially, the 1840s, 1850s, is slavery. And the middle part of the 19th century American politics, 1820s to 1860s, is a series of fights over states, about what places should be states, what places should not be states. Now, this matters because of slavery. So the problem is, and the problem has increasingly been, was even early on in America, that more people were moving to the free states than to the slave states. Now, that's the way things work. There was a better economy in the free states. And people didn't want to move to the South, and people came to America. They moved to New York or to Boston or Philadelphia. They weren't moving to Savannah, Georgia. Now, that might present an economic problem for the South, that they weren't growing population as quick as they could. But mostly it was a political problem. Why is it a political problem? Well, because if all the people keep on moving to the North and moving to the free states, then those free states are going to wind up having more power in the government. Remember, the power in the U.S. government is determined at least partially by population. So if everyone moves to New York gets more powerful, and all the free states get powerful, and the slave states don't, the free states eventually are going to be able to gang up and, in theory, ban slavery. Now, they weren't necessarily thinking about banning slavery in the 1840s, 1850s, but, the southern states were a little paranoid that they might get together and actually decide to do it. So the political crisis, and we see this in Missouri Compromise, Compromise 1840, Compromise of 1850, and all these big political issues of the mid part of the 19th century, is, okay, we're going to bring in more states. How are we going to do it? Well, we're going to balance out power, especially in the Senate, by creating new states. Every state that comes in gets 2 new senators, so we can make sure that the slavery is going to be preserved and the South is going to be able to retain power by making sure that we bring in new slave states. So we're going to bring in new states, and we're going to try and balance it. So every time we bring in a new state, we're going to bring in a slave state, and we're going to bring in a free state to balance it. And if we can't find to balance it, we're just not going to bring it in. So, for instance, New Hampshire used to just be part of New York. It was just upstate New York, right? Maine. All these states were just created in order to balance out new states like Arkansas that were brought in the Union. And so all these states are brought in. We have this continuing crisis in American government over what states should be brought in and what governments should look like and how we're going to basically protect slavery from the increasing political and economic power of the North. The Whig Party, in this case, though, is caught in a bind. The Whig Party is caught in a bind because they're not really against slavery. And the Democratic Party, the Jeffersonian Democrats, are very much in favor of slavery. They're part of the South and the party of agricultural interests. So they very much believe in slavery. But the Whig Party is kind of not against slavery. They're not going to say anything about slavery, about how they want to be against it. Because if they say anything bad about slavery and how they want to ban slavery, guess what? The South is going to revolt. So the Whig Party rule is, it's like Fight Club, don't talk about slavery. They just don't mention it. And because they don't mention it, they're able to diffuse some tensions because the Democrats can't accuse them of trying to ban slavery. The Democrats accuse them of trying to ban slavery anyway. But it's more importantly, they can hold together the coalition because coalition involves a lot of people who are actually against slavery, increasingly after the 1840s, 1850s, but also a bunch of people who just don't want to piss the South off because they've got guns and they're crazy. You don't want to deal with those guys, right? So just leave them alone. And the Whigs, increasingly, by the time you get to the late 1850s, early 1860s, just cannot hold this together. They can't both please the people who are against slavery, and there's increasing the 1850s, 1860s, increasing group of Americans who are just against slavery, mostly for religious reasons, which is the reverse we talked about this before. Previously, slavery was considered to be something God had ordained in the Bible. And so you do get this movement in the 1850s, 1860s America that argues that slavery is bad for white people because it leads them into sin. So we should ban slavery to save the souls of white people, which is maybe the most racist argument I've ever heard about anything ever. Anyway, so the political party comes into crisis, the Whigs come into crisis, and the Whig Party eventually just snaps. It splits up. Basically on the issue of slavery between what we now would call the Republican Party and the old Whig Party. And the Republican Party rises up, the Whig Party collapses, and is replaced by the Republican Party, which is much more of a staunchly anti-slavery party. Now, they're not necessarily saying we want to kill slavery, What they're saying is we want to stop the expansion of slavery. We don't want slavery to expand to new states beyond where they are now. However, this, for the Southerners, is seen as being tantamount to a death sentence. That is, if you don't allow the expansion of slavery, if you don't bring in any new slave states, then the current slave states are eventually going to be overwhelmed by new free states. And they're going to lose power in the Senate, and they're already going to lose power in the House because, of course, more people are moving to the free states than they are to the slave states. So the lack of expansion of slavery proposed by the Republican Party winds up being seen as a death sentence by the South. And so when Abraham Lincoln is elected, the South secedes immediately before he even has a chance to actually do anything. The South secedes because they figure he's probably going to go ahead and do something that would be against slavery. So this sets up our third party system in America. The third party system is the Democrats versus the Republicans. Now, I know that sounds like the party system we have now, but as we'll see, it really is very different. The names are the same, but everything else is kind of different. So the third party system is characterized by the conflict between the Democrats, who are the party of the South, and the Republicans, who are the party of the North. And the Republicans, for most of this period, are the dominant party, especially in the presidency. Mostly because the South is discredited. The Democratic Party was the party of rebellion, was the party of secession, and the party of the South, and that doesn't play well outside of the South. And so Republicans are able to continue to win. So early on, as we are talking about the radical Reconstruction, but eventually, just by what we call waving the bloody flag, that is saying, hey, look, if you're a patriot, you have to support the Republicans because the Democrats are the people who hate the country, who tried to leave. So the third party system is characterized by internal debates in this sort of sectional conflict between the North and the South, and this expansion over into the West, and the conflict over whether the West, new states like, where you go over into Kansas and Nebraska and places like that, whether they're going to be really seen as Republican states or Democratic states. So it's your third party system of Republicans versus Democrats. And that party system lasts for about 40 years until it's replaced by the next party system, which is really about the progressives. Now, this is where things start to get a little tricky. Up to this point, every time we've talked about a switch in the party system, we've actually had to switch in the parties, right? The Federalists are replaced by the Whigs. So we get the Whigs are replaced by the Republicans. So we actually do get to change the name. Starting this point, we don't get a change in the name. So it would be easier to pretend the parties didn't actually change, but they do quite a bit. So the Democratic Party in the 1890s becomes very different. Rather than being the party of Southerners and the party of Southerners and agrarian interests, they start to become the party that's much more concerned with progressive interests. Now, there's a crossover between farmers and the progressive movement, and it has to do with mostly currency reform. This is a really dull topic, but this is also the big deal of late 19th century American politics. It's all about currency. It's about tariffs, whether that's taxes paid by Americans on the incoming goods. You understand that tariffs are paid by Americans and they're actually a tax. Congratulations, you know more about tariffs than our president does. But tariffs are one big issue, and the other big issue in late 19th century American politics is currency. That is, how much money should we print? Now, today we don't worry about this. If you want to print money, you're a government, you've got a printing press, you print more money. In those days, though, we actually had currency that was tied to gold or to silver. And this was a big deal because that limited amount of money you could actually make. The government could only print money if it had that amount of gold sitting in a vault somewhere. That's what Fort Knox is for. And so this is a problem for a lot of farmers because there's just not a lot of cash going around. So they want a greater flow, a greater money supply. And so they're arguing for what's called bimetallism. That is, they want, it's bimetallism, bimetallism. I might have missed an L in there, sorry. Anyway, bimetallism, meaning two metals. Saying the government should be printing based not just on gold, but also on silver. And this, again, is considered to be progressive reform. This becomes the entree of progressives into the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party essentially becomes the party of progressivism. And so this is what we call a realignment. Now, in a realignment, it's not that the party itself has changed. Maybe the people are still the same. But what the party stands for and the coalition that's supporting that party is what changes. And that's exactly what we see here in the 1890s. The Democratic Party becomes the party of progressivism. Up to that point, progressives actually had their own political party called the Progressive Party. And Democrats in 1896 actually just stole the Progressive Party candidate, a guy named William Jennings Bryan. They just stole him. He was the nominee for the Progressive Party. And Democrats said, "Oh, he's our nominee too. He's progressive," and ate the Progressive Party whole, and essentially became the Progressive Party. Now, this wound up being fairly popular, and we can see it took a while, but the progressive movement had a lot of victories. Women got the right to vote. Alcohol was banned. Eugenics laws came in all over the country. So the progressive movement had a lot of victories, and this encouraged the Republican Party to try and adapt. And the Republican Party adapted by trying to take some of these progressive issues as their own issues as well. The big one they did was about restraining corporations. We'll talk about this a little later when we talk about political ideology. The idea of Teddy Roosevelt and other Republican progressives as trying to create a level playing field for average everyday Americans, trying to make sure that political parties and that corporations couldn't take advantage of them. So we have a realignment in the 1890s. So again, you've got the first American political system. You have a realignment in the 1830s with Andrew Jackson, another realignment in the 1860s with the Republicans versus Democrats, another one in the late 1890s with the progressive Democrats versus the Republicans. And that essentially, that schism, that party system of the progressive Democrats versus the Republicans holds up until 1932. In the 1920s, the progressives mounted a lot of victories, but the Republican Party wasn't at all progressive itself. The Republican Party was very much about maintaining normality, they would argue for balance, for moderation. And that viewpoint of the Republican Party really fell apart during the Great Depression, because the idea that we just need to take everything slow and not do anything too crazy doesn't work when the entire economy has collapsed and the farmers are all, and there's a dust bowl and there's all this terrible stuff happening. And even a relatively brilliant man, Herbert Hoover, who's a Republican president at the time the Great Depression hits, can't do much to actually help the country because he doesn't believe in doing anything radical. He believes in working within the existing boundaries of government. And so he just can't do a whole heck of a lot. So the Republican Party is on the outs, and we get a new realignment led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and this is called he puts together what's called the New Deal Coalition. The New Deal Coalition is a realignment in American politics where the Democratic Party brings in a whole new coalition. So the Democratic Party had always been the party of white Southerners, but what FDR does, he brings in new groups. So they're not the party of white Southerners, yes, but they also bring in northern urbanites, people we call classical liberals, people like places here in New Jersey, where people might have relatively liberal social views and economic views. He brings them into the Democratic Party saying, look, we need reform, we need change. He also is able to bring in African Americans. And African Americans, now, we talk about African Americans as voters in the North. Most African Americans at the time still lived in the U.S. South, but we don't worry about their votes because they weren't allowed to vote. Sorry, they kind of still aren't. Mm-hmm. So we get this New Deal coalition of northern urbanites, southern whites, mostly farmers, and northern African Americans. And that group is enough to bring together to get Democrats elected. And this is called the New Deal Coalition. The New Coalition is enough to get Democrats elected for decades. And that coalition is against the Republican Party. And the Republican Party at that point is very much the party of conservatism, about not moving too quickly, about trying to restrain things, about limited government, about federalism, about the federal government not getting more powerful than the states. And that becomes your next party system, is the New Deal Democrats versus the Republicans. And that holds up for about 36 years, from 1932, when FDR first wins, until 1968. Now, if you've been paying attention, you might have noticed something weird about the New Deal Coalition. New Deal Coalition, you could argue, is kind of doomed from the start. And the big problem with the New Deal Coalition is they've got two groups in them that don't necessarily like each other very much. And that is African Americans, the ones who can vote at least in the North, and Southern whites. Because what do Southern whites want? They want to be able to restrain African Americans. Now, what African Americans want, they want not to be subject to the whims of Southern whites. So this is a recipe for conflict. And the Democratic Party falls victim to this conflict. That is, they can't figure out a way to address civil rights issues. Now, as long as the Democratic Party stays away from civil rights, they're fine. As long as you're talking about the New Deal and economic reforms, things like that, no problem. However, once they start talking about civil rights in any way, the New Deal Coalition is going to split, because you're going to have the Southern whites on one side and African Americans on the other side. And there's no way to square that. Now, FDR does it. largely by not talking about civil rights. But by the time we get to the 1960s, not talking about civil rights isn't really an option for Southerners, for the Democratic Party anymore. And there's increasing pressure for them to deal with issues of civil rights. And as a result, the Southern whites, who had been the backbone of the Democratic Party at that point for more than 100 years, going back to Andrew Jackson, start to leave the party. And this is a result of what we call the Southern strategy. It's Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate for president in 1960 and 1968. In 1968, he decides what he's going to do in order to win the presidency is to get the support of Southern whites. Now, this is radical at the time. Southern whites at that point were the base of the Democratic coalition. They had always been Democrats. That they vote for Republican was nonsensical. But the Democratic Party was increasingly being pushed to deal with civil rights issues. Lyndon Johnson, who was president at the time, had dealt with civil rights issues and passed civil rights laws. Now, these civil rights laws he passed, at least initially, are mostly toothless. But the fact the Democratic Party was pushing civil rights was seen as betrayal by a lot of Democrats and Southern white Democrats. And they were right for Richard Nixon and the Republican Party to come in and say, hey, look, we're not going to do this to you. We're not going to go ahead and make you deal with civil rights. We're going to fight against civil rights. And so the Republican Party and Richard Nixon puts together a coalition of voters who are anti-civil rights. So this becomes Southern whites, but also business interests that had always been part in the North, had always been part of the Republican Party, as well as Westerners, people out West. Out West, they didn't have very many racial minorities, so they didn't really care about civil rights issues. They wanted decreased federal government power, mostly because they wanted to be able to increase their ability to exploit the land. So they wanted to have be able to have fewer federal forests and national parks, be able to mine more, get out from under all of this environmental regulation. So Richard Nixon puts together this new coalition, the Southern Coalition of Republicans, who are basically motivated by being opposed to federal power and being opposed to civil rights legislation. And this coalition that Nixon puts together in 1968 is very powerful and holds on tight to American politics and wins most presidential elections between 1968 and 2008. So between 1968 and 2008, Democrats win the presidential election under Jimmy Carter once in the wake of Watergate, when everyone hates the Republican Party because Richard Nixon was so corrupt. And they win under Bill Clinton when they elect a Southerner. When the Democrats elect a Southerner, they're able to win there. But aside from that, the Republicans basically keep on winning again and again and again during that party period. So that's your next party coalition, is the realignment that happens after 68 with the Southern strategy between 1968 and about 2008. Now, here's the problem. We're pretty sure realignment has happened since then. If you're paying attention, you notice that all these realignments happen about every 30 to 40 years in American government, somewhere in there. And this one, well, it's been there since 68. So we're pretty sure it ended at some point. And it seems like the most common ending point for that would be 2008 with the election of Barack Obama. Now, why would we think Barack Obama's election might have been a realignment? Well, the big reason we would think that is that Obama was able to put together a different coalition. That is, he was able to get support of African Americans in the North, traditionally Democrats, but also lots of suburban voters. That is, voters who were traditionally Republican voters in the suburbs, as well as lots of young people and increasing quantities of women. So women, for most American government, most American politics, have been kind of the same as men. There wasn't really a big voting gap in American government, really until the 1980s. And it wasn't until you got to about 2008 and Barack Obama that you had this very, very large voting gap where women were voting very, very differently than men. So it looks like Barack Obama put together a different enough coalition in 2008 that you could call it a realignment. But you can only call it realignment to the extent that it sticks around. So yeah, Barack Obama won twice in 2008, 2012, but it's not like we had this very durable coalition that won in, 2016. Now, of course, Hillary Clinton did actually win the popular vote in 2016, but she didn't win the presidency. So we have to wait a couple more election cycles. If Democrats come back and win strong in 2020 and 2024 and 2028, then I think we'll be able to go back pretty confidently and say, 2008 was a realigning election. We're now in a new American party system. And this one, as far as I can tell, is characterized mostly by rural voters versus urban voters, with suburban voters being the ones caught in the middle. Urban voters, people living in cities and just outside of big cities, for the most part, are very strongly Democratic now. And rural voters, those living far away from cities, are very, very strongly Republican. And so that looks like the big divide, and suburban voters caught in the middle. To put it in another way, almost everywhere that has a Whole Foods is now represented by a Democrat in Congress. Almost everywhere that has a Cracker Barrel is represented by a Republican in Congress. So you've got the Cracker Barrels versus the Whole Foods. They're both terrible. You probably shouldn't go to either of them. I mean, Cracker Barrel will kill you with fried food, and Whole Foods will take your whole paycheck and not leave you enough food to actually eat actual food. But that seems to be the divide now, is the rural voters versus the urban voters. And we think this is going to be a durable coalition, but we're really just not quite sure yet. All right. You know what, guys? I know we've got about 10 minutes left in class, but I think that's about all I wanted to cover. I think it's a lot easier when, well, there's no questions, no interruptions. I just feel like I'm talking to myself. Oh, so what happened to the Progressive Party? So Dave wants to know what happened to the Progressive Party. So the Progressive Party, just died out. It got eaten alive by the Democratic Party in the 1890s. It's actually quite what happened like the Tea Party. Tea Party in American politics was a big deal around 2000, after Obama was elected in like 2010. And then the Republican Party said, oh, that's just us now. And they took all their issues and ate them alive. So that party doesn't exist anymore. David's also asking a little bit about the Green Party and Libertarians, about third parties. We'll cover those in a later lecture. But these third parties essentially work, but on issues where the other parties aren't addressing it. So for a long time, neither party was really addressing environmental issues. And so there was room for a third party to arise that was dealing with environmental issues. Now, the problem is, and that's the Green Party, the problem is that these third parties don't do very well in the American system. Now, in other countries, they can do very, very well. If we're in Italy or we're in France, there could be 5 or 6 or 7 parties. The reason you don't get 5 or 6 or 7 parties in America is that, well, our electoral system is rigged. We're rigged to just have 2 parties. Now, there's something called Duverger's law, the Duverger apostrophe S, Duverger's law. And what Duverger's law said, Duverger's law is really about what we call strategic defection. Strategic defection. So imagine I am a voter who cares deeply about the environment, and I want to vote for the Green Party. But I look at the polls and I go, boy, the Green Party has no freaking chance of winning. We're going to lose. So what do I do then? Well, as a Green Party voter, I've got 2 choices. Well, 3 choices. Choice 1, say, I don't care. I'm going to vote for the Green Party anyway. And if the election is not close, that makes sense. If I know who's going to win anyway, I might as well vote for the Green Party because my vote doesn't matter. Option 2, I just say, well, my vote doesn't matter, so I'm not going to vote at all and stay home. Or option 3, I go, well, I don't like the Democrats or the Republicans, but I like the Democrats more than I like the Republicans. So I'm going to strategically defect from the Greens and vote for my second place party, the Democrats. And that's what most of the voters who would normally support a third party wind up doing. They defect because all our candidates are running for 1 seat, right? You're voting for Congress, there's 1 seat up for play. There's no prize for second place. And so if I think my candidate is not going to win, I'm going to strategically defect and vote for another party. So the Green voters defect to vote for the Democrats. And this is a continuing source of frustration for the Greens, Libertarians, or any third party, that all their voters wind up just voting for someone else. They go and say, no, vote for us this time. Really, if all the Green Party voters voted for the Greens instead of defecting Democrats, we do really well. And everyone goes, yeah, but we're not going to win still. I'm going to defect. And they wind up defecting. So there are plenty of third parties in American politics, and they're subject to strategic defection because the way our political party system is set up. Our election is set up so there's no prize, there's 1 seat, no prize for second place. So third parties are never going to do very well. There's one exception to that, though. And the exception is in nonpartisan elections. We talked about these elections before, elections where there's no party on the ballot. So if I go in the voting booth and doesn't say Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, I don't know who the Libertarian is. So guess what? In those cases, the third party does pretty well. And I use the Libertarian Party on purpose because the Libertarian Party, a party that believes in very low taxes and limited government intervention in the economy and society, does very well in local elections for school board and city council because nobody knows the Libertarians because it doesn't say what party they are. So even though people don't vote very much in those nonpartisan elections, it actually is a big opportunity for third parties. And Libertarians will tell you that they do amazingly well in those elections. And what they take as evidence that people are just biased against voting against third parties because you don't tell them the third party, people vote with those Libertarians all the time. All right, Michael's asking, will we see any different parties win the presidency in our lifetime? The answer is no. Why not? Well, I would actually argue that the Republican Party of today, for instance, Donald Trump's Republican Party, is very, very different than the Republican Party, even 10 or 20 years ago. Donald Trump's Republican Party is the party that's against trade, that's against immigration, that is in favor of increased government regulation of business, So this is very different than the Republican Party of a few years ago. So you can argue that, yeah, third party did win. The sort of nativist, isolationist party led by Donald Trump took over the Republican Party, realigned it, and won. So yes, I think the parties will change. I think the parties already have changed. I think after 2008, we probably are seeing a realignment of the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party. They're very different parties than they were before. But the party apparatus is so strong now that I can't imagine the parties are going to change names. That is, the Democratic Party 20 years from now will be very different than the Democratic Party today. But it'll still be called the Democratic Party for no particular reason. And this does cause a lot of confusion. There's a conservative provocateur, a guy who just likes to piss people off, a troll, on the internet, and releases movies on TV, like Dinesh D'Souza. He was sent to jail for campaign finance problems and actually got pardoned by President Trump because reasons. And Dinesh D'Souza always says, oh, the Democrats are actually the party of segregation and the party that hates black people. And everyone goes, well, yeah, but that was in the 19th century. They were, yeah, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, but that's not today's Republican Party. And it gets confusing for people. Say, oh, but Abraham Lincoln's Republicans, they're Republicans, the party of civil rights. You go, well, not so much since 1968. I don't know what, well, he's not a dumb guy. He knows what he's talking about. He's just doing it to troll people. But this is so confusing again because we don't change the party names. So I don't think we're going to change the party names. You're still Republicans versus Democrats, but the Democratic and Republican Party are going to be super different in 20 years than they are now. Okay. Any more questions? Okay, David, Michael, you guys asked some good questions, so you are getting some extra credit points. Great job. Everyone else, thank you all very much, and I will keep your eyes posted. I'll let you know for Friday what exactly the plan is going to be. Sweet indeed, Michael. All right, have a good day.